So let's go to our next presenter. It is Mahabir, or also known as Marco Oliveira. He has a PhD in maybe in language, and he's a writer, translator, a professor of language, literature, and culture. So he is also an artist, of course, a neo-humanist, and a yoga therapist. He has his alias. He's a poet. He comes in the name of Gringo Carioca, and of course his work. Poems had been published in anthologies and journals and exhibited in museums and galleries. Were they published in and exhibited in Brazil, museums of Brazil? Ah, okay, so they were published and exhibited in the museums and galleries of Brazil. Welcome, Mahabir. Namaskar. Oh, why are you unmute?
Okay, namaskar.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ananda Didi, Ananda Kripa. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you all today in such distinguished company, both the presenters and the audience. And the title of this talk that I'm going to give is the art of yoga and the yoga of art. And this talk is basically the fruit of some recent research I've been doing. I wanted to investigate not only the relations between art and spirituality, which is it's actually a popular topic, but specifically trying to think of art in the context of yoga, and also yoga in the context of art. So much of what I will be sharing today is ongoing research that I'm going to share with you. I'm among many things, I'm a teacher, but I like to teach by learning. So I'm also always a student. Much of the philosophy that I'll be sharing is based on the teachings and discourses of Shrii Shrii Ánandamúrti. So I'm going to share my screen. I cannot share the screen. Dada, can you enable my screen? Okay, and there we go. Can you all see the screen? Yes. Okay. So the art of yoga and the yoga of art. This talk is basically divided in two parts: the art of yoga and the yoga of art. And I'm going to basically focus on how both art and yoga can be thought of as a practice, a philosophy, a science, and an art in the case of yoga, and yoga in the case of art. First, let's talk about yoga. When most people think about yoga, the majority of people, we could say in the West particularly, they think of yoga as a practice, right? A practice specifically related to postures and exercises that are good for flexibility, circulation, respiration, strengthening of muscles, relaxation, among other benefits. Some people also associate yoga with the practice of meditation. And of course, meditation is part of yoga. But for the majority of people in the West, yoga does not really go much beyond that, right? For the more knowledgeable people, though, people are aware of a more complex form of yoga that we can call here Ashtanga Yoga or Raja Yoga, which would be the 8 limbs of yoga. And those are, of course, as you can see, Jama Niyama related to ethics, asanas or the postures, pranayama, breath control, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and finally samadhi. So those who have a more profound knowledge of yoga know that the systematized practice of yoga involves all of these 8 aspects. As we start getting deeper and deeper into yoga, we see that yoga is much more than a practice. It's a philosophy. The philosophy is what founds the practice. And this is evident in the term itself, yoga. One definition, if we look at the Sanskrit, is that yoga can mean unity or addition. But another more profound definition is that it means unification. So the Sanskrit etymology of the word yoga means unification, and we will look and see what kind of unification that means. We have different definitions of yoga by different either philosophers or personalities, gurus from India. The most famous is probably from Patanjali, who in the Yoga Sutras basically defined yoga in two ways. The first, that yoga is the suspension of all psychic propensities. So basically the emptying of mind, the suspension of thought, controlling, stopping thought. And another definition is when the mind is free from any sort of thinking, the mind is completely free of thoughts. That state is called yoga, right? So it's related to the first definition. And this is to show how yoga is a philosophy. This is a philosophical definition. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is also an authority of yoga, right? Krishna, as a character in the it's actually a poem in the Bhagavad Gita, but he defines yoga in two ways. Yoga is skill in action, and the second definition, equanimity, is yoga. In other words, having a balanced mind. And finally, Shiva, from whom in our yoga practice, Tantra yoga was given, who introduced or systematized yoga first. According to Shrii Shrii Ánandamúrti, Shiva defines yoga as the unification of the unit soul, the Jivatma, with the universal soul, that is Paramatma, is yoga, right? So now we see exactly what is meant by the term unification. It is the unification of the unit being, the individual self, with the, let's say, universal self, cosmic being. And that is what yoga really means from a philosophical perspective. We can also think of yoga as a science. It is often said, particularly in Anandamarga, that yoga is an intuitional science. But if we compare, for instance, yoga to the Western concept of science, we have some definitions of what is science from a Western perspective. Science can refer to branches of knowledge or study. It can refer to a systematic or systematized knowledge obtained through observation, experimentation, and or study. And science can also refer to a skill or proficiency via the knowledge, the application of the knowledge acquired. So if we think of yoga from this perspective, we can definitely agree that it is a branch of knowledge, right? It is a systematic knowledge obtained through observation, experimentation, and study. And it's also a skill, right? Something that we do, right? In the yoga, compared to other branches of Western science, we see that yoga branches out into all of these sciences that you see on your screen. There are aspects of yoga that have to deal with ethics or moral philosophy, with sociology, anthropology, biology, psychology, theology, metaphysics, physics, and even political science and economics to an extent, and finally linguistics and aesthetics, which is the main topic that we're going to discuss today. So yoga addresses all of these areas in some way or other, although it's also not to be confused with any one of these particular sciences. So how can yoga be considered an art then, in addition to a science, in addition to a philosophy, and in addition to a practice? if we look at the basic definition of art, we see that the definition of art is that it's a skill or technique, right? The art of, I don't know, the art of making coffee, or the art of anything you do. You can make it into an art. And the idea is that it's refined, that it's a skill, it's a particular technique of doing something, and particularly doing it well, right? In addition to being a skill or technique, we also, when we think of art, we think of certain principles and methods to do something well, right? So every art implies particular principles and methods, right? And finally, we can and must think of art as an action or an activity, something that is done, right? So if we take our practice of yoga, right? If we take our philosophy of yoga, and even the science of yoga, and if we think of it as a skill or technique that can be perfected, that can be refined, that has principles and methods, and something to be done, right? And to be done well, then that is the easiest way of thinking of yoga as an art, perfect practice, right? So now I want to shift focus a little bit to art from yoga, and discuss how art can be viewed, conceived, ultimately as a form of yoga, right? So when we think of art, we also think of it as a practice, right? When we look at the etymology of the term art, it comes from the Latin ars, right? And ars can refer to a work of art, also to a practical skill, or a business or craft. Again, something that it is done, right? That you do, like a profession. The term is related to other terms in Sanskrit and Greek, but the concept of what art is in Western culture actually derives from the Greek term techne. And in techne in Greek means an art or craft or skill or a technique. But when we talk about art today, what we think about are a series of things. One of them being either the production or the expression of beauty, right? We cannot dissociate the concept of art from the concept of beauty, and particularly the production or expression of beauty. When someone composes a work of art, they are expressing something, an idea, a feeling, in a beautiful way. We can discuss, you know, what is beauty in another context, but here let's just focus on the production or expression of beauty. We also think of art not just as a production or expression, but also as the work itself, right? A work of art. So an aesthetic object or an aesthetic work, like a painting, like a poem, etc. And we typically think of art, in Western culture, in terms of either fields, genres, or categories. So traditionally, we have the 7 arts. We have the arts of architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, music, drama, and film. Film is, of course, the most recent art to be added to the list, because film has a history of a little over 100 years. But these are the traditional 7 arts. Of course, today there's lots of mixed media arts where all of these genres interact. But traditionally, these are the 7 arts. So what is the relation then between art and philosophy? It's a very long relation and a very deep relation. Particularly when we think about the philosophical aspect of art, we think of the term aesthetics, right? And the term aesthetics comes from Greek, and aesthetikos in Greek is of sense perception, and that comes from the term aesthesis, which means sensory perception. That's the origin of the term, and art has everything to do with sensory perception, which we will discuss a little bit more later. But in general, when we think of aesthetics as the philosophical part of art, we think of the study of beauty or taste, right? Why are things beautiful, or how are they beautiful? Taste in this case means appreciation. In general, we think of the philosophy of art, right? And the principles behind artistic practice, right? So that's what we think of when we think of aesthetics. And probably one of the most famous Western philosophers who discussed aesthetics was Immanuel Kant, the German, in the, I believe, 18th century. And he tried to define aesthetics, but particularly aesthetic judgment. How do we conceive of art, or how do we determine what is art, and how does art work, etc. So for Kant, aesthetics has everything to do with pleasure and delight, right? However, it is not that something gives me pleasure and therefore it's art. It's a particular kind of pleasure or delight that comes from the fact that something is art, right? And I know that's difficult to understand a little bit, but one of the ideas is that this experience needs to come out of what he called a sort of a disinterested relationship. In other words, like I said, it's not because I like something that I consider it beautiful. It's the other way around. It's beautiful and therefore I like it, right? It gives me pleasure. So in this case, what the art comes first, the pleasure comes second, I guess we could say. It's a pleasure or delight derived from the disinterested appreciation of beauty or an aesthetic work. So in that case, art, to be able to conceive of art, it's not just it is subjective. It depends on the mind and the sensitivity of the observer, right? I feel pleasure, I feel delight in something beautiful, but it's also something that can be sort of rationally considered to be universal. That not only I should be able to receive pleasure and delight, but everyone should be able to sense the same thing, particularly if using, you know, reason or the intellect, a rational capacity, right? And finally, for Kant, art should be purposive, not necessarily have a purpose in sense of a utilitarian value, but there is a purposiveness behind art, like a reason behind, right? That reason could be to express an idea or a sentiment, or to create an idea or a sentiment, but there is a purposive aspect to art. And the last thing I want to mention, because of Kant, and I'm mentioning all of these things in order to be able to talk about Ánandamúrti's theories of art soon, to be able to compare. So Kant made an interesting distinction between what he terms the beautiful and the sublime, right? So the beautiful for Kant is related to the sensible, right? And it's related to form, right? Something that, you know, like in other words, an object can be beautiful, an arrangement can be beautiful, a work of art can be beautiful. The sublime is related to the supersensible or the formless. So it's generally something that is so great, or it goes beyond our capacity to understand it, or even to sense it with our senses, right? That would be the sublime, right? So Kant makes this distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, which will become useful later for us to talk about Ánandamúrti's theories of art. So how can we think of art as a science? We saw earlier that technically speaking, that the difference between philosophy and science is not really distinct, right? Philosophy can be considered a science. We have the human sciences, for instance, in which philosophy is a part. But in this case, I want to introduce a term that Ánandamúrti uses called aesthetic science, because he does not, this is the term that Ánandamúrti uses. So I'm going to share with you some quotes that from Ánandamúrti about aesthetic science, and sort of try to interpret it, and also compare it to some Western concepts of art and aesthetics. And generally, I'll comment on it. So this first quote: in the process of the artistic endeavor to advance from the crude to the subtle, people develop the science which is called aesthetic science, right? So here Ánandamúrti is laying the groundwork for his theory of aesthetic science, and basically emphasizing that it has to deal with a particular movement, which in this case it's a positive movement and advancement from crude to subtle, right? From the material to the immaterial, and we see this again in the next quote. This very movement from crude to subtle, from ugliness to beauty, from imperfection to perfection, is the first stage of aesthetic science. We should remember this idea of stages, because towards the end of this talk, we will talk about the final stage of aesthetic science. But here we see again this movement from crude to subtle, and also the introduction of the concept of beauty, which was mentioned in when I mentioned Kant, and when we talk about aesthetics in general. And so this is the first way Ánandamúrti defines aesthetic science. Obviously, aesthetic science is related to art, and we know that art is related to expression, right? And also pleasure, right? So this other quote by Ánandamúrti: there are subjects that are not expressed in normal language. Subtler feelings are expressed through the most subtle modes of expression. Suppose I saw some particular thing for a certain length of time and enjoyed it. The feeling behind such enjoyment, the bhava or idea, the reason why I liked it, all these, when expressed through sweet, subtle language, are what is called aesthetic science. So here we have, again, the idea of art as a form of expression, right? In this case, aesthetic science is like the study of those forms of expression, or the technique, we could say, also. And the importance of feeling or sentiment, of enjoyment, right? But also of reason, right? Of the idea. This is where the mind comes into play. Another example: suppose you want to convey to others the intrinsic beauty of all things that gives delight to everyone. You may arrange those things artistically, or you may not only arrange them, but also convey them to others in a very sweet and lucid language. Yet finally, you need not even achieve this objective through exquisite language. The message can also be driven home with the help of brush or pen. This is what is known as aesthetic science. So here we see more how aesthetic science is related to art, right? Art objects. Dada before me was talking about painting, right? So this is the science behind what Dada was talking about. And finally, to get to the essence of the matter, the feeling that is at work behind aesthetic science is nothing but pleasure. So here we have what Ánandamúrti says is the essence of aesthetic science. It's pleasure, it's enjoyment, it's delight. As we see in the next quote, if you ask artists or architects as to why they are busy with their art, they will say, we get pleasure from it. This is aesthetic science. A poet composes a poem because he or she gets pleasure. But it's not only an individual pleasure. It's the pleasure that an artist, in this case, gets for himself, but also what he or she gives to others, right? So as you see in this quote, the quintessence of aesthetic science is to get and give joy. It's not only individual, but it's a collective. And this is actually essential, and we will touch on this point later. So to summarize, aesthetic science has to deal with joy, with the pleasure and delight. These are all feelings. It has to deal with beauty, right? The expression of beauty, artistic, poetic expression. And finally, to give this a more traditionally scientific perspective, right? It also has to deal with sensory perception, or what Ánandamúrti calls inferences. So there's actually a science in the traditional sense behind all of this. The term that in Sanskrit is Nandana Vijnana, aesthetic science, and the term Nandana is one who gives joy to others and gets joy from others. We saw this definition already, but the definition in this case is related to the the term itself, right? Both to give anandam or bliss, joy, and to get anandam. So this is a more precise definition of the term in Sanskrit, which is translated as aesthetic science. A little more about Nandana Vijnana. It is the science which has for its basis the joy derived from the expressions of the mind at different stages from the various ways in which the mind becomes concentrated in its different expressions. So here we see, again, the idea of joy being important, but also the importance of the mind, right? When we talk about perception, it's the perception of a mind. It's how the mind interacts with the world and with others. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just because of time. So I'll end with this last quote. So I'll end this section. Whenever sound, touch, form, smell, or taste comes within the scope of someone's personal inferences, that would be their perception, right? And if that is agreeably pleasant to the mind and nerves, that person will try to attract that thing. If the object is mobile, he or she will draw the object. But if it is static, he himself will go to the object. One feels attraction for the lofty peaks of the Himalayas. It is impossible to attract the Himalayas. That is why humanity reaches out to the Himalayas to come in contact with the entitative form of the mountains. The point here is this: the Himalayas do not attract people. It is people who want the Himalayas. People want to attract the mountains to themselves, but since this is impossible, they rush to the Himalayas. This is all aesthetic science. So this is a more or less a new element being introduced here. This idea of attraction, right? As you see below, this is from a discourse called Krishna and the Supraesthetic Science. And Dada Pulak talked about Krishna earlier, about how Krishna is always attracting with his flute, right? So part of aesthetic science and supraesthetic science, as we'll see later, is all about attraction and the pleasure that sort of drives this attraction. And I will now move to talking about art as a form of yoga, right? So I'm sorry, my PowerPoint is going crazy. Like I said in the beginning, art and spirituality are often thought of together, right? Much art is, of course, imbued with spirituality, and much spirituality is imbued with art. But how can we think of art as a form of yoga, right? Particularly through this lens of Ánandamúrti's theories of art. So I want to backtrack a little bit and again, go back to this idea of movement that's involved in aesthetic science, to be able to talk about what Ánandamúrti calls the supraesthetic science, which has some similarities with the Kantian sublime. This continuous progress from the crude to the subtle, and from the subtle to the subtlest aspects of life, comes within the scope of aesthetic science. And in this process of movement, ultimately we reach a state in which our refined tastes, refined feelings, and refined expressions transport us into the realm of eternal beauty. Then those who attain such a state will no longer possess the ability or capacity to taste the beauty of anything, because at that time they will have attained a state so intoxicated with joy that they will lose their limited identity and thus their ability to experience anything. This exalted state beyond even aesthetic science is called Mohana Vijnana, or supra-aesthetic science. So this new theory basically is saying that there's something beyond aesthetics, right? Supra-aesthetic. In this case, it would be the culmination or endpoint of aesthetic science. So aesthetic science would be, of course, that movement from the crude to the subtle, but the end point of that movement would be eternal beauty. It would be a sort of loss of self, right? And a loss of identity, right? And which is termed Mohana Vijnana, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. Again, the stage when we lose ourselves in ecstatic bliss, when we merge into the supreme entity, is called supra-aesthetic science. I'll skip ahead a little bit. So if the stage of movement is the stage of aesthetic science, the stage of merger, when we have lost ourselves in the supreme, and we have no desire for anything else, is the stage of super aesthetic science. So those of you who are reading this are probably thinking to yourself, wow, that sounds a lot like yoga. That is what yoga is, right? Unification, union with the supreme consciousness, right? So super aesthetic science, in this case, to sort of sum up these concepts, is related to ecstatic bliss. So again, not just joy or pleasure, but bliss, eternal pleasure, infinite joy, eternal beauty, super sensory perception, again, based on inferences, not just attraction for objects, but attraction to the divine, right? Divine attraction. And finally, ultimately, merger with the supreme consciousness, which is the aim of yoga, right? Again, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And so I'll just discuss this last phrase before concluding. I've been trying to show how we can create this sort of analogy between art and yoga, right? And show how they are analogous, and that ultimately, at least according to Ánandamúrti, they have the same aim, right? Which is union, right? Union with the supreme consciousness. And how does this occur in super aesthetic science? It's a little different than aesthetic science, because in aesthetic science, it's the artist who's producing, right? Attracting, giving joy, getting joy. Super aesthetic science comes from the supreme consciousness himself, right? It's all his work, we could say. It's his work of art, and we are participating in it, and we are part of it. It's his composition, and also we're the observers, etc. So I'll read this quote: "Padma Purusha alone is the presiding entity of Mohana Vijnana, and not any other entity. When jivas feel this attraction in the heart of their hearts, they think it is an excellent idea to draw all human beings to his charming sweetness by their loving hearts, and then guide them along the path of supreme beatitude, the path of all-round perfection, just as Padma Purusha attracts all by the radiance of his unbounded love and affection. So those who love the Supreme, those who are genuine devotees of Padma Purusha, are bound to love all and attract them to the path of supreme blessedness." So again, if we read this, we immediately must think of yoga as a philosophy, as a practice, particularly the yoga that most of us here in this room practice, right? As a form of devotion, bhakti yoga. To conclude, what would be, the ultimate purpose or purposiveness of art, right? We saw how, as a form of yoga, it has everything to do with, let's say, self-realization, of bliss, of ananda. But it's also clear, and we know this from our practice too, that it's not only an individual affair, it's also a collective affair, right? So that is the major difference between Western aesthetics and the aesthetics that Ánandamúrti is propounding. Western aesthetics inevitably leads, for the most part, to the concept of art for art's sake, as if art itself were some kind of God or purpose in and of itself. Ánandamúrti basically argues that we should not think of art that way. In fact, he says clearly, the statement "art for art's sake" is not acceptable. Rather, it is better to say "art for service and blessedness." Blessedness was in the previous quote that I just showed. But we could reformulate the initial question I just asked at the end. For what does art serve? What is its purposiveness, right? In a nutshell, it has to deal with welfare, right? Of attaining and bestowing happiness, right? Through, of course, through creative expression, but not just individually, for the collective, right? If the sweet, benevolent sentiment of individual life fails to inspire collective life, we cannot consider such a creation as art, right? And so where do artists fit into this, right? So if I made the analogy between yoga and art and yoga, we have to also make the analogy between the artist and the yogi. So in this case, according to Ánandamúrti, the ideal of the artist is to be established in transcendentality beyond the bounds of the sensory world. So the artists, or more precisely, the worshippers of fine arts, have to be spiritual aspirants if they want to move on the right path. And more about art and the artist. And this is probably it is the last quote, and it's maybe the most important. Why art, right? Art is one of those sources from which common people get the opportunity to become established in the cosmic mind, right? So if the mind of one fails to know the minds of others, if the minds of many are not comprehended by the mind of one, then how is the establishment of unity possible? The endeavor or sadhana of the artist has been continuing through the ages, and its aim, or its purpose, is to see one among many and to lead the many to the path of one, right? So that is Ánandamúrti's ideal of art, right? And also how art can be thought of as yoga, right? It's a way, to achieve yoga, right? Of union, right? And not just individually, but collectively, right? It is for, as the motto of Anandamarga says, art is not only yoga, but art is for self-realization and for the welfare of the universe. That is my research. As you can see, it's ongoing. I have been studying the discourses and teachings of Ánandamúrti, and I know it was a lot to talk about in a short period of time, but I thank you so much for listening, and hopefully I will develop these ideas, and I plan to write about them in a clearer way, hopefully also. Namaskar.
Thank you. Yeah, namaskar. Thank you so much, Mahavir. I think when you finish your research, you will end up doing kirtan.
You're absolutely right. Or before also. Before I do my research.
Yeah. And you are a poet, right? And I want to ask you a question. Like, when you write a poem, how does the ideas come to you? Or to your
honestly,
mind?
they come from some unknown place that I don't know where they come from. They're not really mine, but then they take form in,
yeah.
They take
like
form
they
in
sort
my
of
mind.
Flowing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the same with people who compose kirtans, tunes, and the tune just come in the mind also. So we know that it doesn't come from us. It comes from somewhere else, means from someone else. No?
Yes, it's like we are entrusted. We are given, material to work with, and then we try our best to work with material, and then we give it back. We give it back to where it came from.
Okay. Yeah. We wish we had more time so you can expound more on your research, and it was a very, very good class actually. Yeah. One of my favorite class. I like the aesthetics, Yeah. Thank you so much, Mahavir. Namaskar.
Thank you, Didi.
Yeah,
Namaskar.
namaskar.